I'm going to press record. Right then, this is the second uh, Ecological Explorers Club slash Guild of Ecological Explorers. Well, it's the first Ecological Explorers Club slash Guild of Ecological Explorers um, Christmas lecture. It's the second Ecological Explorers Club Christmas lecture. So this is trying to give some meaning and purpose to basically getting together for a drink and a bit of a chinwag. And so what we've done is we've Andrew Wilson is here, and he's kindly offered slash been voluntold to deliver the second Christmas lecture. He delivered an excellent one last year, so this is the sequel. So we're hoping for good things. Is it the difficult second album, or is it in and of itself just a brilliant follow up? We will have to see. It also coincides with being the 300th episode of the Talent Equation podcast. And what better way to celebrate the 300th episode than with um, all of my friends in the ecological community coming together, a little bit of Christmas celebration. If you're in the right time zone, you can have a bit of a drink if you want to. If you're not in the right time zone, you could still probably have a drink, depending on your proclivities. If you've just woken up, like some of us, then maybe it's not the best bet. But anyway, that's entirely up to you. So anyway, that's my kind of intro. Andrew's going to lead us off with a lecture. Then we're going to open it up to a bit of Q&A and have a general discussion. And then we can switch off the recording and see where the rest of the conversation takes us. Let's see how we get on. Andrew, thank you for doing this, and over to you.
No worries. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Good. So, by lecture, I'm going to try and keep it as informal as possible, but I am an academic, so I do have some slides, but they're mostly just to remind me about what I was going to talk about. Um, so I was thinking about what the most useful thing to talk about to this group. And I mean, I've been up to some stuff, but I was thinking that actually probably the most useful thing I could talk about was a recent paper that came out by a couple of people who are not me, from the ecological community about memory and about what memory is from an ecological perspective. And the reason why I thought I would talk about this paper and sort of use it as a springboard for a conversation is that it's the question that, frankly, we always get asked, or it's one of the big ones that I always get asked about how you could possibly talk about memory in a way that isn't about representations, isn't about information processing, isn't about brains as computers, etc. And we don't have a full answer, but there's a preprint just out from Robin Wilford and Mike Anderson. So Robin's a graduate student in a neuroscience lab, and Mike Anderson is a philosopher slash some sort of ecological, done some ecological neuroscience things. And they've just put together a paper that I thought was quite good. And it's just in a preprint stage, so it's nice. I've been reading it and thinking about it, and I've blogged about it. I'm just trying to engage with it at this early stage. And the thing about it, I quite liked that they've written down a bunch of things that I think are basically true and that might be useful for us to start thinking about. And so I've got a few slides. I do not want to deliver a lecture on slides. I want to walk through a few pieces of the puzzle and introduce some of the terms. And then I kind of want to open it up, ideally, to a discussion about how you'd go about sort of could you use this reformulation of what memory is to answer some of the questions that people get, and could how would you engage with it in your practice? I think would just be the kind of interesting thing. Is that okay? Does that sound all good? I've got the chat open as well, so if, I'll wander along. If you want to stop me and ask a question, feel free to wave and ask the question, or if you drop it in the chat, I will see it as well. So let's see if this works. Share. So Can you see those slides? Yes, everybody see that? Good. So, like I say, I don't want to sort of do too much of a lecture thing, but I need these just to keep track of where I am. So, so the paper that came out is called Radical Embodied Memory, and it's got a few moving pieces, and I still think it's in the early stages. But fundamentally, what it's trying to do is to do some useful work, which is to create a vocabulary for talking about what memory could possibly be and how it might work without appealing to the traditional elements. And that's really important work. It's not, it's the very first step in a process, right? So, as academics, as we're trying to figure these things out, I've come to realize that one of the first steps in engaging with a new problem is figuring out the vocabulary to talk about it. And the reason is that we're not allowed to use the vocabulary that was previously around just because it has nothing to do with the way we go about doing business, right? So, I mean, I've known this for a long time, and hopefully you know it as well, but I've been really engaging with it. Marianne and Rob Gray and I have been going through Michael Turvey's books recently and his lectures on perception. And the big takeaway from that book is the degree to which the ecological approach is a completely and utterly different root and branch approach to thinking about how this could possibly work cannot be overstated, right? In philosophical terms and in the literature, the word radical, that's what that implies. It's not just another way of doing business as usual, it's an entirely different way of doing business. And that's tough, right? Because people have been doing business the usual way for a long time, and there's lots of ways of talking about these things, and there's lots of experimental results. And so it's hard to engage with these topics until we can talk about them. So I've got one slide talking about some pointing out some key words about how memory gets talked about, and those are the things that we need to try and replace. I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing the elements that Robin and Mike have brought into their paper and some of the vocabulary, some of which you might be familiar with, some of which you might not be. So let me know one way or another. It'll be interesting to know what people know. And I've got a couple of things that have occurred to me as I've been reading this paper that I wanted to bring up that hopefully might be relevant. And then, like I say, I wanted to kind of work my way through this fairly promptly and then primarily open it up to a discussion about how you guys were reacting to it. Okay. So right. What is the question of memory? Well, the question of memory is that we clearly have the ability to organize our behavior with respect to things that happened to us in the past and are not currently happening to us right now, right? And so that's a fact, right? There's, a million different ways to demonstrate this. So that's the capacity, that's the phenomenon, right? Turvey calls it retrospectivity just because he likes giving things fancy words to contrast sort of with prospectivity, that future-oriented behavior. And so the question is, how do you build that? What do you need to have in order to build a system that can exhibit that behavior? And so the basic idea is that something about us has to change and remain stable in some sense, and such that we can bring it along with us wherever we go and then reveal it under various circumstances. So memory implies that things happen to us in the past and something about that experience is kept and preserved. And then we have some sort of access to it and can bring it back into the present so that it can shape our behavior. And so the question is, what remains stable over time? And so the traditional, this is the traditional thing that should not be complicated. The traditional model, the brain as computer information processing approach, the idea is that you have some experience and then information about that experience has to be encoded in some way. So you have to take that information and it has to be turned into something that you can store. So you're in a training session, you're learning how to kick a ball or swing a bat or something, and you don't bring that whole experience with you. So something about that experience has to be encoded so that you can keep it with you, presumably in here, right? And so, when you talk about encoding, there's, when psychologists study memory, they ask questions about, well, is it visual? Is it auditory? Is it some mix? And so on and so forth. So you can ask questions like that. So encoding is the first thing. Once you've encoded the experience, taken it from the fact that it's happening into something that you can then potentially store, you have to store it somewhere. So the idea is that the encoding of the event must be stored somewhere in some location. And again, that's presumably what the brain is doing. And then, of course, that's only useful if you can retrieve the information later on, right? If it can shape your behavior later on. If it can't shape your behavior later on, then who cares and how would you know that you had it, right? So you need these three things: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And so those are the three elements that the traditional approach implies. Now, the thing about this take on memory is that it is, by definition, basically the most representation hungry problem you could possibly have, right? It demands something like a representation in order for any of this to work. You encode things into something that can be stored, that isn't the thing itself. That's literally what a representation is, right? If you store it, you need to be able to access and pull it out and so on. And you bring it back at a time when things aren't happening again. So the reason why memory is a nuisance for ecological types and why it keeps coming up is it seems to demand representations. What else could it possibly be? And so I'm not going to spend any sort of significant time here, but basically the traditional approach to answering the question of what stays stable is basically a representation, so you can either talk about it as a mental representation, if you're a cognitive psychologist, or you can talk about it as a neural representation if you're a neuroscientist, and maybe that neural code is implementing the mental thing. But whatever it is, it's in long-term memory, right? And there's lots of different flavors of long-term memory. So the research program that psychology produces to study memory is we have this ability to remember things, to do memory things. We call that to bring things from the past into the present, and we call that memory. And then when you go poking it, you find a couple of different memory works on a couple of different time scales. So you get short term and long term. And then if you poke short term, it turns out to be made of different bits. And if you poke long term, they tend to be made out of different bits. And so what you end up with is this description of all these parts that seem to be required in order to demonstrate what we consider memory. So all of this is not, the information processing approach is not just something that's being pulled out of nowhere. It's sitting on top of a lot of hard work and thinking and experiments and people trying to disentangle, can you have one thing without the other, and and so on and so forth. But the idea is that from this point of view, the thing that remains stable over time that gets brought with you is the encoding in long-term memory storage, right? Either episodic or semantic or procedural if you're doing some kind of movement task and so on and so forth. So this seems like it's the only way you could possibly do it. But of course, as ecological psychologists, we can't avail ourselves of any of that vocabulary. It's of absolutely no use to us whatsoever because we're simply not engaged in that kind of enterprise. And so the first question you have to ask yourself and then come up with an answer is what might this be if it's not computation? So I don't know how familiar you guys are with this Van Gelder paper, the classic What Steam Governor paper by Tim Van Gelder. And the paper is called What Might Cognition Be If Not Computation? It's a great paper and it's one of the early dynamical systems papers, right? But basically, in order to begin telling an ecological story, you have to stop, ask yourself this question, and then what Van Gelder reveals is that the answer is, if it's not computation, then it's going to be dynamical systems, and those things can be different from one another. And so his famous example is the Watt steam governor, right? So very briefly, what a Watt steam governor is. So James Watts, the Scottish engineer, he's facing a problem. He's got these new steam engines and he wants them to do mechanical work for him. And you have to take the energy from the steam that's running through it and turn it into like rotary motion and things. But the problem is that you need to maintain steady rates, right? You can't, and the problem with steam coming through the system is that it comes through sort of unevenly in bursts because it's not being pumped through reliably just because of the nature of generating steam. And so the issue is what you need to do is take an erratic steam, a flow of steam, and turn it into some sort of smooth flow. And there's Van Gelder in his paper points out there's two basic ways to do that. The computational solution, what we would probably try and do today, would be to get a computer and it would go, step one, measure the flow of steam. Step two, compute any corrections. Step three, pass those corrections onto the controller. Step four, measure the result. And then just keep running in this algorithmic kind of loop. That's one way to do it. Turns out it's not the only way to do it, and it's not the way that Watts did it. Why? Well, mostly because he didn't have computers, but also because there's another solution. What you do is you build the steam governor, right? And all it is, it's basically this device that it's got these weighted arms, and as the steam rushes through the system, the arms come up, and as the pressure goes down, the arms come down. And then what you do, is you couple, that's kind of the perception bit. This mechanical device measures the flow of steam effectively. And then you couple that to an action bit, to over here, to this throttle valve. And as the arms come up, that closes continuously that throttle valve, which then reduces the flow of steam and then it balances out. And basically what you do is you set it at a target and the system settles into a nice, smooth, controlled flow. Nothing in this system is computational. It's an entirely mechanical device that works because of the kind of device that it is, because of the parts that it's built of, and the way in which those parts are put together. That's textbook dynamical systems, right? That's what it means to have a dynamic. Means you are built a certain way. And when those parts that are coupled together are allowed to run, they behave in a certain way. And if you build the right kind of device, then the behavior suits the task. The moral of the story of this paper is simply that there is an option to computation, nonlinear dynamics, and two, dynamical systems produce pretty stable kind of results. And so we get very excited about this when we measure action and when we think about how people move and when we think about perception action coupling. The language of nonlinear dynamical systems has exploded into here. And so basically what Wilford and Anderson are asking is, can you do the same thing, take the language of nonlinear dynamics and use that to reconceptualize the problem of what memory is? How are we doing so far? I have lost the chat window actually, so if there's any questions going on, somebody let me know.
It's all good, Andrew. Don't worry. I'll let you know if there is.
All right, so just wave at me. Okay.
You can still see us.
I can see a couple of you.
Okay.
So, all right, so that's the setup. We have this problem of memory. It seems to demand computation and representation. What else could it possibly be? The answer to that question is always dynamical systems. So how do we develop a way of talking about memory that's dynamical and not computational? That's the point of this paper. So there's a series of pieces that these guys bring together to suggest a way of thinking about memory. And it is a little tricky, and I'll try and step through it, and we'll see how it goes. So what we want to figure out is what remains the same, what remains stable over time to enable something like memory. But we're allowed more than the brain, right? When we talk about the brain, the unit of analysis, the thing that we study is actually not just a brain, but it's a brain and a body and an environment, all of which are coupled together into a system. So the system, there's kind of a catchphrase in ecological psychology, but the unit of analysis is the system, right? And you can look at the bits scientifically, but actually, if you want to understand how any of it works, you have to look at how these things work together as a team, right? And so the basic form of the system is that there's the environment full of affordances and perceptual information. There's the organism full of effectivities and limb dynamics and the capability of picking up information. And then we are coupled to our environments through perception, and we couple ourselves to our environments through action, and that's the loop, right? The perception to our dynamics, we shape ourselves into an action system that operates in the world, that has consequences that then are then perceived, right? And it's that loop, that whole loop with all those pieces, that's the unit of analysis. So we don't just have brains. Those aren't the only tools we have available to us. We have the system. And so the question is, well, okay, well, what is it? Okay. So, oops, thank you. The slightly complicated hypothesis, which I'll step through, is that this system, this brain, body, and environment system, is shaped and reshaped by its activity. So when you do something, this system changes and evolves in line with what you are up to, right? And the system is shaped and then reshaped by its activities. And every time you do something, you become a slightly different dynamical system. So right now I'm one particular dynamical system, and I've been around for however long I've been around, and I have certain kinds of capabilities and potential things that I can get up to. And then I go and, I don't know, start bouncing a ball against a wall and learning how to bounce that particular ball. That activity changes me, is the hypothesis. And it doesn't just change my brain, but it changes my perception because I'm learning to pick up new information variables. It changes my action because I'm learning how to use those information variables to form an action system. And I'm learning how to couple that action to that information, to the world through that information. So doing something changes me. And it makes me the kind of thing that can do this new trick, as well as all the other tricks I am technically capable of producing, right? And so the idea, so I've become a dynamical system that has a certain composition, and I've changed that composition, and I've changed the way those pieces relate to one another. So I've changed the kind of system that I am. Now, when you describe a dynamical system, mathematically, you describe it in terms of its state space, right? And so I'm an extraordinarily high-dimensional dynamical system. There's lots of axes, there's lots of variables required to give a comprehensive accounting of me, right? So in practice, there's no way to actually do this. But the intuition is, if I had all these variables and could map them all out, then I'd be able to characterize the kind of dynamical system that I am. And the thing about that state space that we call it is, once you've got that state space, that description of all the things that the dynamical system is capable of doing, independent of whether it's currently doing them, now you can figure out, well, okay, how do you move that system around that state space in order to be able to do different things? And so the thing that remains the same over time is not something that has been explicitly stored anywhere. The thing that remains stable is the new dynamic that I've formed, right? And the idea is that memory is the reconstruction of enough of the pieces that were present when you did the thing in the first place that you are able to recreate the activity. All right, so that seems quite vague. There's a lot of moving parts. Let's see if we can make it ever so slightly more specific. And at this point, it is only slightly more specific, right? We don't have a straight up mechanism here. At this point, all we're doing is developing vocab. So how the hell could this possibly work? Well, Wilford and Anderson then introduced some notions. Specifically, they focus on Anderson's notion of talons, transiently assembled local neural subsystems. It's his hypothesis from his book about basically how to talk about how the nervous system organizes itself. But one of the things I noticed when I read the paper is that his notion of talons and how they use it here is very similar to the notion of synergies, which you guys might be a bit more familiar with in terms of, say, movement synergies. in that so a talon and a synergy are effectively just they're temporary assemblies of your degrees of freedom into, there's lots of names, into a task-specific device, right? So if I want to go and bounce a ball, I have to reorganize myself. I've got a lot of moving parts, some of which are joints and fingers, some of which are neurons, some of them are neural connections, some of which are perceptual capabilities. I need to reorganize those so that I can turn into something that's capable of bouncing that ball, right? So I have to get up, I have to get a ball, I have to maintain posture, I have to do different kind of movements than I'm doing now, right? And this kind of talk is actually really common and pretty straightforwardly accepted by a lot of even the basic motor control literature, let alone the ecological approach to studying movement, right? The idea that how you go about, we have all these degrees of freedom. I'm sure you're familiar with the degrees of freedom problem, right? Or possibly even the new version of it, the bliss of motor abundance. The idea that we have all these moving parts, and it tends to get talked about in terms of joint spaces, but obviously some of those moving parts are neural connections. We have all these moving parts, all these degrees of freedom, all of these different ways of solving problems and creating movement solutions. And that's good. That's the bliss of motor abundance, where we are really usefully flexible so that we can move in a wide variety we can solve the same problem in a wide variety of ways. So if you're a bit tired or a bit fatigued or carrying a small injury, you can still do the same thing, but you might achieve it in a different way. That flexibility, that creativity is really important to movement, and it couldn't possibly be any other way. What these guys are going to suggest, they're going to focus in particular on talons because, of course, a big chunk of the work of memory is going to be done by the nervous system because it's the system that can change really fast and change in ways that have less to do with what's going on in the world. But the basic idea is the same. So we just need to be able to tell a story about how we arrange these bits into the dynamical system that resembles what we were when we first encountered the thing we're trying to remember, right? Does that make sense? There's quite a few pieces there, and there's a couple more bits just to finish off, but to kind of tie it together. But all of this kind of language is all fairly familiar to me as a researcher, and hopefully familiar to you guys as well if you've encountered ecological ideas of how movements are organized. It's just now we're explicitly including the neural component. So notions of soft assembly, etc. What do we do with all of this stuff? Well, okay. We need to replace encoding, storage, and retrieval somehow. And so the basic hypothesis is that encoding is not a process of taking some sort of imprint of what happened and then storing that imprint. Encoding is what happens, is the embodied experience of you self-reorganizing yourself in the moment while you are doing the learning. You assemble yourself into a particular configuration to do a particular task, and encoding is the development of that capability. You are spending time learning how to become the dynamical system that can do that task, which means that now becomes part of your state space. You're turning into a device that can, so you start out as a baby, you can do one thing. And then you learn another trick, and now you're a device that can do two things. And then you learn something else, and then you're a device that can do three things. And each of those it's not that the final device is not that one plus that one plus that one. You're an entirely different thing than you were when you could only do two. But now you've turned into an entirely different thing, but that accommodates all of those three. And then you learn another one, and then you learn another one, and then you turn into, someone who can do lots of different things. So the idea is that you are becoming this high-dimensional system that has within it the capabilities of becoming one of many different kinds of things. That's encoding in this framework. What is stored? Kind of nothing is stored. That's one big thing here. You don't take this state space. The state space isn't anywhere, right? It's not that you've got a state space that you can go look up, or you don't have a state space that you bring into short-term memory and look for to try and find the schema that's got the plan for this particular task, right? Storage is the brain-body environment becoming, it's the encoding is the process of encountering the new thing that you want to do. Storage, to the extent that there's anything that's changing, what's changing is you, all of you, the brain, body, environment, system, and all the relationships between the various parts. So what's stored is all of the possibilities that you now embody, right? And so then you have to be able to retrieve this at some point. So retrieval is the brain, body, environment system reconfiguring itself back into something that is close enough to what it was before in order to be able to generate the behavior. And by close enough, I mean you don't have to be exactly the same device, because you can never be exactly the same device. But that's okay, because notions of synergies and all those notions of abundance and things mean that there's more than one way of being that one particular device. You just have to be you have to be in the right kind of region. And so one of the things they talk about in the paper that I actually think is really important is they talk about the importance of the cueing. So in the process of testing memory. And I've always thought that this was important. Whenever you test the memory for something, you have to provide somebody with a cue. You have to tell them what you want them to remember. So there's a process of reconstructing, using the cue, and using that to get yourself back into a state where you are able to answer the question. And I think this is just formalizing that idea and taking it a bit more seriously than other people do. So we've got some replacements for those things, but it's all still a little vague and abstract. In the paper, they come up with one specific example to try and explain what this is going. So I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to try and explain how I normally conceptualize this kind of idea. So the question is, they take a simple example and they ask the question of how water remembers how to go about being either ice or steam. And so if you have some water, it has the ability to become steam, or it has the ability to become ice under certain conditions. And so the question is, how does it know how to do that, right? And if you were talking about asking this question of an organism, you'd immediately start doing memory kinds of questions. Well, water doesn't remember how to be ice, and water doesn't remember how to be steam. But what water does have is that water, by virtue of the way that it's made, it's a particular kind of dynamic, pieces put together in certain ways, that mean that under certain conditions, specifically as you change the temperature and change the pressure, those are the state variables of your state space. As you change those temperatures, you move around the state space, and water becomes ice or becomes a gas when the conditions enable, when all of it comes together, not just, so the ice doesn't actually have to do all of the hard work of remembering how to be ice and steam. Why? Because the world does some of the work for it, right? So it's an ice environment system that's doing the remembering, if you wanted to talk about it in this kind of way. So what's stable here is the state space. The analogy is that the brain, on the bottom diagram here, we've got a brain variables and a brain axis. It's going to be a lot of different things, but we'll start with that. We've got a body and we've got an environment, and the idea is that as you move around, as the environment brings you, provides certain things for you, and the body provides certain things for you, and the brain provides certain things for you, that moves you around your state space, and the potential of that state space to exhibit memory A or exhibit memory B or exhibit memory C, that potential becomes actual as you move around. And so memory A doesn't, when you're in memory B, memory A isn't stored anywhere, but memory A is still something you are capable of becoming under the right conditions, right? Here's how I always talk about this. And I've talked about this in a couple of papers before, where I've tried to kind of wrangle with this question. And I talked about this ages ago, and I always think about it. I play softball, so I always think about this in this terms, right? So the question is, when I go up to bat in softball, how is it that I remember how to hit a softball, right? And right now, I don't think it's meaningful in any way to say that I currently know how to hit a softball. I don't have a bat in my hand. There's no softball present. I'm just sitting on my sofa, right? The conditions aren't right for me to exhibit the memory of how to hit a softball, right? Or the skill that I've learned. So the fact that I can say, well, I know how to hit a softball it's almost just a quirk of language. It doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of what's actually going on. That's quite an important distinction. So it has always struck me as the case that it makes no sense to say right now that currently I know how to hit a softball. However, I can become something that can hit a softball. And I was thinking, and I think about this a lot. So what do I do in order to become something that can hit a softball? Well, I go to a softball game. I pick up a bat. I swing that bat around, right? So as I'm swinging it, I'm generating information about the characteristics of the bat and getting a sense of that. And so I have done this previously. So I have learned how to detect relevant information variables. So those suddenly become present, right? By the action of me swinging the bat. I go up to the plate, I swing the bat a little bit. We all have our little routines for when you get up to the plate. And then I stand and I get into my stance. And what do? I look at the pitcher. And now the pitcher's going to release the ball. And then I swing at it and then I hit it. And because I'm fabulous, I hit it for miles and it's great and everything's very exciting. Right. But what's happening? In order to demonstrate that I really have learned how to hit a softball, namely that there was something that I didn't know how to do, and now that I know how to do it, that definitely involves some memory, right? I can't demonstrate that until all of those things line up, right? Now, it's not identical every time, right? The pitch is slightly different because the pitcher's trying different things. I'll be on different fields because I'm playing in different tournaments. The weather will be different. I will have eaten different things. So I won't be identical, but I will be able to bring myself into the region. And if I am able to fully bring myself into the region, then I hit the ball, right? Sometimes I miss, or sometimes I foul it off, right? So there's plenty of ways this can sort of break down. But again, the point is that right now, if you scanned my brain, right, in whatever detail your magic system wants to be able to do, and then you took all that information and stuck it in a computer, and then you tried to get that, and you got that computer to power a robot, and you got that robot to play softball. If you measured me now, I don't think that robot would be able to play softball, right? Because all you've measured is some of the components required. You haven't measured any of my perceptual skills. You haven't got any of my action effectivities or any of those couplings, etc. So this is what it means to remember something, is that the reason I can hit a softball is that in the past, I have encountered softballs while I've had a bat and I have swung and done all the things where I've explored the space to learn the information and learn the perception action couplings, etc., etc. So I've done all of that work in the past. And because I have done all that work in the past, when I come up to the plate, that reforms in real time. So my activity, my embedded, embodied activity, brings all of that from the past into the present. So it's a verb your noun kind of situation, right? Memory is what we call it when we do things in the present so that we assemble ourselves into a version of something we were in the past, such that we can reconstruct that thing from the past and bring it into the present, right? That's quite a complicated sort of thing, but it's a verb your noun scenario, right? Let me flip to this, right? In this approach, there are no memories. There is only remembering. So it actually shouldn't be radical embodied memory. It should be radical embodied remembering. And that's just this is how you start telling an ecological story. You take your noun and you turn it into a verb. Why? Because we are verbs and we are not nouns, basically, when it comes to figuring these things out. So that's the idea. That's the vocabulary. At this point, there's no empirical evidence for a goddamn thing about this. Why? Because no one's studied it yet. You have to do this work first of doing the vocabulary. And I really like this paper. I think there's things they need to tweak, but I think the basic thrust of it is bang on. And I'm not just saying that because it aligns with my intuitions, although it does. So that's the idea. So there are some things that I have thought of, some implications that I want to flag up, and then I want to turn it over to you guys, and if there's a conversation, to talk about, does this mean anything to you? Could you use it? Does it relate? How would you go about attacking this question in your practice, right? So I'll just flag up. I'm going to come to you guys in a minute. So a couple of things. Verb that noun. We don't owe the world a solution to the question of what is memory. We owe the world a solution to the question of what is remembering, and that's quite important. That's a move that we have to make. Why? Because it opens the door to there being something other than computation. One thing I mentioned the third one as well. I mentioned this earlier, the role of the prompt, right? Wilford and Anson talk about this a little bit in the paper. I think that how you bring someone into, or how you get someone moving along the path of remembering is quite important. So, and I think this aligns with actually quite common empirical findings. So all the Loftus stuff around false memories and around, if you ask some eyewitness testimony, how easy it is to bias those memories. The classic example is, you ask somebody to witness a collision in a video, and you ask them either how fast were the cars moving when they hit each other versus when they smashed into one another, right? The two different questions set off a different process, and you end up you think the speeds of the cars were higher in the crash situation. And so people talk about this as the reconstructive nature of memory, and they talk about things interfering with the encoded thing. You encode the experience, but this verbal prompt has colored that somehow. I think that's just a question of, well, you've got people to engage in the process of remembering along two different routes. And it turns out it's quite easy to do that, such that you actually end up in quite a different place. And I actually think that one of the questions then is for coaches, you guys are training people in a practice session, and you want that behavior to show up in a game scenario. That's remembering, right? And so you also want you train them in a training situation, and then you bring them back the next week, and you want them to remember what they did last week so that you can build on it. So I think there's going to be all kinds of interesting questions, and I'm wondering about whether or not there's things you've encountered in your own practice about how you go about prompting people so that to try and get the most useful process of remembering up and running. The final thing that it occurred to me recently thinking about this paper. A lot of this sounds it just sounds a bit hand wavy, and it just sounds about, it could be anything. It sounds all quite vague. None of this would convince, any of the villains of our community, right? But it occurred to me that we're all quite happy to talk about how skilled perception action can be achieved non-representationally, because it's all about coupling with things in the present, etc., like that. But the word skill and skilled perception action absolutely entails some sort of remembering process, right? You don't get skilled straight away. So I think that we need to start fronting up to that a little bit. But I also think we've got a foot in the door here by the fact that people are happy to talk about skilled perception action as being, sure, maybe that's where affordances are. Maybe the ecological approach is how you explain how people move, but it doesn't explain how we remember, I don't know, strings of digits. Maybe it doesn't explain how we do strings of digits, but the point is that thing you're happy to talk about in these non-representational terms has baked into it the process of remembering, which means that the process of remembering is okay to talk about non-representation terms. So that's a half-formed thought, but it just occurred to me that there's a foot in the door there. That's it. So there's a bunch of moving pieces, and the idea is that it's just trying to develop a vocabulary, and I'm just kind of curious to see what you think. So that's it. And I've just seen some questions. So let me have a quick drink, and then
there's quite a bit of commentary going on, that more than questions. So I'll open it up and let people ask questions rather than you have to read through the chat, Andrew.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I apologize. I thought I was going to I had the chat up, but then it vanished when I shared my screen. So.
No, 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 not at all. And yeah, I mean, I don't know about everybody else. I'll just speak for myself. But firstly, I'm indebted to you for sharing that because I had a go at sort of delving into the paper ahead of time and was sort of struggling my way through it. But what you've done is really bring that to life in a much more approachable way for me. Anyway, I've got a million different thoughts, so I'll use sort of host prerogative maybe just to kick us off, and then we'll see where we get to.
Yeah, cool.
Uh, One of the things that jumped to my mind was you must have seen the there's a I'm sure it's a you've seen on YouTube, but there's a YouTube guy who did this whole big video about the backwards bike.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and how had to sort of, he'd get all these people on stage who thought they could like, ride this bike
yeah,
across the stage and they would like win $100 and nobody could.
yeah,
And how he sort of almost taught himself to ride the backwards bike. And then when he went to ride a normal bike, he couldn't
yeah,
ride the normal bike.
yeah,
He kind of could sort of quite quickly, but you know
yeah.
how people often say, oh, it's just like
Hmm.
riding a bike.
Hmm.
Well, turns out it's not, is it? And so, from a movement perspective, it made
Yeah,
me think of that a little bit in terms of saying that the assumption would be that we would have encoded, stored, and be able to retrieve the motor program or whatever it is
yeah,
for riding the normal bike, having relearned to ride, having sort of retrained our senses to ride a backwards bike.
yeah,
And you're having to literally recalibrate everything. So
yeah,
to ride the backwards bike, you've got to inhabit an entirely different state. You've got to massively recalibrate and reassemble in an entirely different state space.
yeah,
And then when you come back to the normal bike, you've got to do that reassembly again to a certain extent. I might be
yeah.
oversimplifying a little bit, but I felt like there was something there in that analogy that might be helpful here.
So there's two things about that example that I quite like. I'd love to run those studies again properly and really get into the details of the process of learning the backwards bike and then the degree to which it interferes with the other one. But to the extent that it does, right, that's quite interesting. So you've gone through a process, a series of experiences in which you've added to your dynamic the ability to organize yourself into a backwards bike riding device, right? So you've added that skill to your repertoire. But in order to do that, you've had to reorganize your entire dynamic into a new thing, because that's what you always do when you learn a new skill, right? When you go from two to three, you don't just add that one in, you become something entirely different. Being able to do one, two, and three is qualitatively different from one and two, not just, you know. So you've added this new thing in. But the interesting thing about adding that new trick in is that in order to do it, you've had to reorganize yourself into something new that no longer accommodates riding the bike normally. This is, I think, quite interesting. So it reminds me there's a whole bunch of empirical research around perceptual adaptation and the limits of perceptual adaptation. Like you can do things with prisms and you can have people reaching in certain ways, but there are some things you can do and there are some things that you cannot do, right? And there are some things where if you learn that trick, it definitely screws up the other one because those two things are incompatible in quite a deep, usually, mathematically defined way. And that incompatibility means that you can be a device that can do one of them, or you can be a device that can do another thing, but there's no such thing as a device that can do both of them. And so therefore you either get one or the other. There's a whole, what was her name? Felice Bedford. I remember reading a whole bunch of this stuff when I was in Aberdeen. It was all quite interesting. And so again, what the backwards bike suggests that it's possible to be a system that can do a whole bunch of things, one of which is ride a backwards bike. And it's possible to be a person who can do a whole bunch of things, one of which is ride a normal bike. But it's not possible to be a thing that can do both of those because there's some sort of fundamental incompatibility there. The traditional approach, I don't think, has any coherent way of explaining that, if it's to the extent that it's true. And that's why I'd really like to run those experiments again properly and really poke it to see just how impossible it is to be both. There's lots of ways you can tell a story, the information processing approach. Well, this one interferes with that one, and it's the classic way is to draw a performance competence distinction. The idea is that you still know how to ride the bike, but there's something interfering with your ability to perform that competence. You see this kind of performance competence distinction all the time in research, and it's nonsense, right? Performance is competence. Competence is performance. There's no other way. You can't be. It doesn't make sense to say I can do something if I can't show you that I can do it, right? So yes, I think that's a great example, and it would be an interesting one to poke. And I think that this dynamical way of thinking about what remembering is, sorry, I think would have quite a natural way of handling. Yeah.
Yeah. Danny, I think you've probably got to build on that.
To an extent, I just wanted to clarify when you say riding a bike backwards, I assume you're referring to the video Smarter Every Day, Dustin
Yes.
from Smarter Every Day did, where
Yeah.
he moved the handlebars left and the front wheel goes right, you
Yeah.
move the right and
It's
goes
not
left.
riding a bike. Yeah, it's riding a backwards geared bike. Everything is all the couplings are reversed, right?
That's what I thought, because when you said riding backwards, I imagine some people
Sorry.
are thinking actually cycling backwards, which not quite. I was thinking about the same thing, riding a bike, because I've heard some people say that you can forget to ride a bike over a certain amount of time because the memories decay if you haven't ridden it for so long. And what this one of the adults that I coach in trampoline said we're talking about a front somersault, front flip, and they learnt how to flip. And then the next, right, same time, next week, they had forgotten how to flip. And they
Yeah.
couldn't work out how, well, I learned to ride a bike, then I could ride a bike. I learned to flip, now I can't flip. Uh, and we didn't get to discuss it, but I think it's interesting how riding a bike is a skill, but in trampoline, a movement, even though it is a skill, are drastically different. You jump slightly higher, slightly lower, the flip's got to be adjusted. The way that you do the flip's got to be adjusted. Cycling is the same, but I can go on a big bike or a small bike and still figure out how to cycle. So what
Yes.
those
Ah,
schemas look like, I don't know how that would be explained.
well, so in the dynamical vocabulary, you have variables and you have parameters, right? So the variables are things like for the ice condition, right? For the water, the variables are pressure and temperature. And then the parameters are the specific values of pressure and temperature that you've picked at a given moment in time. So the state space, in the state space description, one axis of your graph is one variable, and then the parameter is where along that axis that you are. So when you're talking sort of mathematically about this, that you draw those distinctions between those things. When you say that something has a particular dynamical organization, you're always talking about variables, right? So and the idea is that in order to learn how to ride a bike, you have to take the relevant variables and arrange them into the right relationship to one another so that you get bike riding out rather than bike falling off, right? So there's a couple of options for arranging these things. Then if I give you a small bike versus a big bike, what you've got is the same variables and different parameters. And so you get things like in the learning how to put the variables together is kind of education of attention. And then learning how to get the small bike versus the big bike is calibration. And these things are distinct processes. Absolutely, they're very distinct things. And they reflect different, yeah, they reflect you interacting with different sort of facts of the scenario, if that makes sense. So the answer is yes, there's a way, I think, of talking quite naturally, dynamically about the difference between those cases. Does that
Something
answer?
that something that I've experienced when trying to, because I used the same explanation when I was sort of arguing with myself and reflection after having that conversation. And something the other coach I was working with said is, isn't that the same as stages of learning? Fitz and Posner's model. You do
Sure.
this, this, this. And I can see where her
Yeah,
thinking
sure.
was.
Absolutely. Well, so yeah, so basically the stages of learning kind of idea is basically a description of the process of tuning in of, and you do have to go through different, not, they're not stages, but you do have to go through different steps when you're learning something, right? The first thing you have to get yourself into the ballpark. Then you have to get the ballpark assembled correctly, and then you have to tune it up to meet the local conditions, right? And so then, yeah, absolutely, there are dynamical ways of talking about that process. And so the stages of learning idea is a description of that, of what that looks like from sort of the outside. It looks like there's different stages and it looks like you're doing different things. But then the other thing, of course, built into the stages of learning is the notion that what are you trying to do? You're trying to build the skill to the point where it can run automatically. I don't think there's any such thing as an automatic skill. I think everything is always under some sort of control. And if it wasn't, you'd be screwed. And exactly how that control manifests, it's not that it's, being off by the brain or, there's lots of different ways of assembling that control. But in order for it to be a skilled movement, there's no such, I think automatic is entirely incorrect, right? But the reason why you have those stages of learning is that that's one way of describing kind of the bumpy road of skill acquisition. And you're just identifying where some of those bumps are and you're giving them certain names. But just because you gave them those names and correctly identified where some bumps were, it doesn't mean you've actually identified why there's a bump there. And the bump might be, well, you've achieved some stage, or the bump might be, well, we've got to the point where we're at least working with the right variables. We haven't put them together yet, but at least we've encountered the task enough that we know which pieces we need to solve the task, right? And by know, I'm using that quite loosely, right?
The other thing that occurred to me, and I'll sort of come in with a sort of second reflection whilst I'm waiting for other hands to go up in case people have got other questions, if it's being too polite. I liked this notion of there is no memories, there's only remembering.
Yeah.
And the difference of language. Because I think one of the things that a lot of people in this room who are, we're not just ecological practitioners, we're ecological evangelists in some cases, aren't we? Or at the very least, we're, responsible for trying to communicate some of the possibilities of the ecological approach to others. Or we find ourselves in conversations. One of the things that we come up against a lot, and often I think we don't necessarily have an adequate response for, is the notion of muscle memory.
Yes.
And the easy response and the glib response is muscles don't have brains, therefore muscles can't remember. But that doesn't solve the problem, actually. It's
plants don't have brains, but they can remember stuff, right?
Exactly. So the point is that it's not necessary. That's not good enough. So what I like the idea of, though, is that what we're not after is muscle memory. We're after muscle remembering. Now, that might not be quite right, but it feels to me like it's a closer approximation to what we might want to be talking about.
And the one final step is that you replace memory with remembering, but don't forget, you're allowed to replace muscles with brain body environment systems.
There you go. Perfect.
So
And that's the bit that they miss out, you see, is they're only ever working on one sort of scale of analysis, i.e. either muscle or brain or body as separate entities, whereas we always put them together. And I noticed you always did that, to the point of you always were saying brain, body, environment, to the point where when I was writing my notes, I kept having to write brain, body, environment. I was finding it quite frustrating.
Yeah. Well, it's, we kind of need a word to describe the whole thing, but we don't have a word to describe the whole thing because of Descartes, basically, Dan Descartes. So it's funny, like when you have to say brain, body, environment, system, it sounds like you're describing three entirely qualitatively different things that somehow have to be made to talk to one another. But what you actually have in brain, body, environment is those are three words that point to three different aspects of a system that is never really separate, right? You can separate some of those bits out, right? I can take my body and put myself in a different environment. You can there are boundaries and but they're the same kind of thing all the time, right? And it's just an artifact of the way we talk about them that makes them sound like they're different things. But yes, the
There's
trick
also
with
the
muscle
issue.
memory, I've thought about muscle memory a lot in the past, and the memory simply doesn't reside in the muscles. It resides in the perception action coupling that the muscle takes part in, right?
Yeah. So it's
Is
not
it
to
the
say that
command?
it's not. Sorry, Simon. I'll let you go into this. So it's not to say that
Your Honor.
muscle memory in and of itself is wrong. It's just leaving out too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The reason
Okay.
why muscle memory seems mysterious is that you've just left out some real key players.
Nice. Sorry, Simon. Come in.
Oh, also from the traditional sort of approach also looks at far more of a command control structure.
Yes.
Is that sort of accurate as well? In that the reason why they need that muscle memory sort of explanation is because the assumption is that the brain controls absolutely everything and is the master of all of those things, as
Yes.
opposed to it being far more egalitarian and there
Yes.
being a constant balance between all of those sorts of things. And I
Yes.
think that comes to that same desire of wanting to separate the brain as being, I don't know whether it's got its roots in religion and things, with wanting to have a soul sort of separate to a body, but we sort of want the brain and all of these mental processes to be actually completely separate from the rest of the organism, which is, of course, absurd given that your brain is fundamentally attached to the rest of your body and swims around in the same environment.
Mhm. Yeah. So a couple of things there. Yeah, there's some good stuff in there. So a couple of things. As soon as your theory about what's going on introduces a dualism, you're screwed and you're doomed forever because dualisms cannot be solved, right? That's the first lesson. And the second thing you were talking about is that, yeah, absolutely the assumption of the brain being in charge, right? It sends out the commands and there's this linear chain of commands that end in action. Whereas what we're talking about is this much more loopy circular process. And I liked that. What did you say? It was it's all a bit more egalitarian, right? So Gibson has this great phrase in the 79 book where he he proposes that it is possible for behavior to be regular without being regulated. And what he means by that is that you can have stable behavior that exhibits patterns without that pattern being imposed on behavior by something that's in charge, by a little man in charge, or right, well, by the brain. How do you get behavior that is regular without being regulated? Nonlinear dynamics is how you get that, right? Self-organization under constraints is how you get that. And so everything I was talking about, it was occurring to me as I was talking, was was talking about, the remembering is a process of reassembling yourself into something, that approximates where you were in the past so that you can recapitulate where you were. But there's nothing in the system, there's no one in charge, right? There's no one in charge telling you you have to get to this part. What happens is that you get to that region by a whole bunch of things working together, and some conditions have to apply. And that's why it's difficult. You can't always remember what you wanted to remember, right? Sometimes you walk out the door and it turned out that being in one room rather than another room turned out to be a critical piece that you can't bring with you, right? So, like, yeah, so it taps nicely into a lot of ecological ideas, but you're absolutely right that the shift has to be from there being a controller doing the thing to this more egalitarian self-organization under constraints, regular without being regulated kind of motif.
Danny?
Yeah, a couple of things. The first one, as soon as you mentioned muscle memory, I started thinking about ecological haptics from like Turvey's research and
Yeah,
detecting
sure.
like haptic information. So it's always interesting when you or when I discuss how we would describe detecting information. We can say we can hear silent objects and we can feel the length of things without having like seeing anything. So even though muscles don't have memory, we can still detect information that we
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't traditionally associate with that sense.
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Well,
yeah.
because they're a perceptual system sensitive to information, and experience, your experience of the world is specific to the information that you pick up. And so if you can pick the information up, then you can get the experience. And it turns out that there's information for the length of objects and how it moves and that information can be picked up by the haptic system, right? Absolutely.
And the other thing I was thinking when Stuart mentioned scale is David Farrack and Damien Kelter-Stevens talking about sort of scale of measurement and where the measure starts and the measure ends, and when you
Yeah,
have a
sure.
memory and remembering, and you could go as far as, well, I started remembering when I was born, or potentially even before birth, as some people would argue. And it's always interesting to think about how that would be tested in a lab
Yeah.
setting. How would you, like, where would you start the remembering process of the skill? Because we've already had past experiences that will relate to developing whatever skill it is that we're trying to measure the learning of. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how we could do that, whether that's independent analysis and some smart math way or something I'm missing.
So, right. I suspect this is related to, so in the direct learning sort of framework, you have the education of intention, which is the development of the purpose to do the thing that you're then going to attend to all the relevant information variables and then calibrate it, etc. And I think that the education of intention is something that we don't actually really know how to study and that we basically take for granted in the lab right now. So when I bring somebody in to study how they've acquired a new movement and do they remember what I trained them on last time, I solve the intentionality problem for them by telling them what I want them to do. And I stay focused on one particular skill and I don't ask questions about how these things are nested or related. And I think we don't quite know how to study that yet. It's the question is sort of starting to show up in people who study how affordances relate to one another. Are they, if you have multiple affordances in a task, are they nested? Do you pick them up separately and relate to them separately? Do you pick them up as one higher order thing? How do you put that together? But I'm not sure that we know how to engage with this just yet. Part of the problem is that this dynamical description makes complete sense, but giving the actual dynamical description of a person who came into my lab is completely and utterly impossible and probably remains permanently impossible. It's too high dimensional. So what we do is we have to bring the dimensionality of the task down by asking them to do one thing rather than another. We'd have to start studying people over longer terms. That's why I would, yeah, interesting. And obviously, as coaches, you get to see people for longer than I do in the lab. So maybe that's how that goes. Yeah.
Rafa, what's on your mind?
Sorry, because my brain is just going everywhere. So I'm sorry. I might be a bit complicated, but first of all, Andrew, thank you for doing the work with Turvey, with Marianne, and I'm really following every week, and I get a bit lost, but you said at the beginning
Don't
that
worry, it's fine.
at the end of it, you get more intelligent. Well, I don't know if I'm getting more intelligent, but probably better than when I start. I started. So you, yeah, just for two things. I was just muscle memory. I was discussing with a couple of guys, well, a couple of people. One is when I was teaching jiu-jitsu. The other one was someone talking about bodybuilding, because they said, "Oh, when we train, our muscles pump, and then um, uh, and then when I stop training, my muscles reduce size, and then as I start training again, the muscle memory just bring me to pump again." And I was like, "Well, from like a a medical experience is like there is no muscle memory. Your body is looking for homeostasis. We're
Yeah.
designed to save energy because that's how we are designed for. That's why the fight or flight comes from, you're saving energy, the mass energy. That's why you eat, and if you don't waste, that energy is going to be in your belly because you don't waste. So I said, look, your body is just basically going to homeostasis. And as you start training again, you start taking your creatine, you go back again. So you kind of putting stuff in your muscles and they grow. And the same thing was like, well, was about the when I teach jiu-jitsu, that people talk about like the static drilling, and they say, oh, this is building my muscle memory. And then I kind of post something that, you're just building like generalized transfer. Yeah, so it's just you're doing a form. So the
Yeah.
drilling is just creating form. But as soon as I put you in a live environment, that form, the transfer is almost new. So the muscle memory is just like I had a long discussion with them. And then going back to, where you guys going through turf, that. So I said you have to go back to all this computational stuff for them to understand. Like Keith Davis said once, all this language is all based on
Yes.
cognitivism and all that, the what they call it when the computerized stuff. So it's like that's why we're bringing that. And then just one, so for skills we're looking for the meta stability, like create the unstable environments, so we can bring, like, the way we put it, like get the attention to just like amplifying a lot of options in the environment. So I'm directing you to see different things. and then you're just picking up this information. And that's why, going back to Stuart said a long time ago, and it took me a while to understand, skill acquisition. So skill acquisition for me links straight to like logical and storing somewhere. And skill adaptation is about being fluid and adaptable to new information that I'm capturing in the environment, or AA affordances, or everything that happens. So I just felt like that was just like more like a thought than a question. Just try to explore if I'm going the right direction, or
There's a bunch of interesting pieces in there. So one of the ideas from this paper, right, is that the state space for memory includes the body, right? And so you could have a situation, so you doing the bodybuilding situation might be a case where the amount of brain involved is pretty low and the amount of environment involved is fairly low, and that most of the work of the remembering is all happening and being implemented by the body, right? And so, yeah, this kind right, and that kind of aligns with a really important fact, an ecological fact about skill acquisition, is that you get good at doing whatever it is you're doing. And so the question, of course, for a coach is to design the training environment so that the thing you spend your time doing also shows up on game day, right? So the question of transfer of learning is actually all about, have you provided people with experiences such that they're going to be able to engage in the process of remembering on game day? And the thing about, with the bodybuilding and all that sort of stuff, like if you do it once and then you take a break and then you come back to it, part of it is that your body has changed in certain ways such that when it encounters those activities again, it has a leg up already on what happened previously, because the things you did earlier changed your body, and it changed it into not something that remembers how to do a particular curl or whatever, but it's changed it into something that responds a certain way to that activity. And that's right. Yeah, so right, okay. So you're asking some interesting questions, which is, how would this approach enable you to talk about other aspects of memory, like learning and transfer of learning is a memory question fundamentally, but it doesn't actually always get talked about that way. And it's certainly not when I studied. I've never really thought about it quite as a memory thing, but I should, I think. Yeah. And I think the answer is that there's lots of, like, what counts as remembering on this brain body environment sort of notion is lots of things, right? And it's just about, you have to be, the way in which you notice that it's all the same thing is by giving yourself a big enough space to work with, right? So if you just think it's muscle memory, you're not giving yourself a big enough space to operate in, right? You're only talking about one aspect of the problem. And yeah.
this is for the jiu-jitsu guys. The way I'm designing the practice is I'm getting them not to just use what is like, look, I mean, not to get them to just, if they think, they freeze, but I'm trying to get them to experience in the moment. So like I want you to feel my rhythm, like the rhythm of my breathing, because if I'm breathing fast, that means my pressure is working on you.
Yeah,
The
sure.
feedback that I'm calling like regulated tension. So when I touch you, if I hold you, I'm connected to you. You turn, I turn. If I allow to be fluid, that the haptic feedback is for you. It kind of triggers you because you feel like I'm connected. But if you move, I will allow you to. So it's almost the bricksmanship. I'm inviting you to take the action so I can do something else. And the vision, like, we use the vision initially, but once we are connected, your chest is here, my vision is gone. So I have to use all the other senses. So I know this is from more like embodied cognition, but is that the embodied experience? So the whole body is in the moment. So I know it's not from the ecological, but I thought it's the 4 E's, but now it's the 5 E's. But then someone told me it's the 6 E's because they say emergent is the 6 E's. But anyway, I'll talk too much. I'll let other people.
No, that's cool. Yeah, there's some interesting moving pieces in there. And again, it's about, right. So the idea of like just thinking, this is why sports is quite an interesting domain for all of this, because if you think that the decision making in order to how to respond to a certain attack is an algorithmic process, then you have to have sort of if-then kind of statements. Like, no, you might allow yourself more interesting algorithms, but fundamentally you need something a bit like that. But it's impossible to fully describe all the necessary and sufficient if-then clauses in order to come to the right decision. Whereas what you actually need to be doing is you need to learn how to relate to some physics that's happening to you, right? So the thing you need to demonstrate in the moment that you've learned, that you have remembered, is you need to demonstrate that you know how to couple yourself to those dynamics and shape those dynamics to suit yourself rather than your opponent. And so, yeah, but so again, all I'm doing there, I haven't said anything profound. All I've done is some of the reformulation, all right, do the vocab thing. Change the question to one that an ecological approach stands a chance of answering. Yeah.
There's a nice queue forming of hands up.
Excellent.
And people have been very, very patient. So Marianne, come on in.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Fascinating. Yeah, I really appreciate it. I'm curious about, just going back to the comment I put in the chat, actually, around things that I don't know if they're control parameters, but something that has a big effect on maybe not memory, but certainly on ability. And I'm thinking around the sports that I'm involved with, and the what happens with people who they talk about losing a skill. Or losing confidence, and normally it's because they've had a bad swim. So they come out of their boat, the roll fails, they have a swim, they have a scare, they get, or a bad fall in climbing or one of the other sports. Now, for me, the really interesting bit is that people who are very skilled and who probably have the action capabilities or understand what's happened can have worse experiences and not be affected.
Yes.
It's normally people who are early or are novices will have what might be perceived as a minor bad experience by someone else, and that has a profound effect. So there's some non-linearity in perceived meaning of experiences here in the memory of the whole ability to do something, that I've always found really fascinating because it's so pertinent to those sports.
Yeah. So let me think. Yeah. So right, I was just having a look at your question in the chat. I think it's a good one. I think the first draft of a way to go about thinking about this. So, all right. Another rule for ecological psychology is you have to take things one task at a time. So there's no general answers. There's just sort of general principles that you then have to apply specifically to a specific case. So one aspect, right, there's two sort of related questions there. One is that if you have some experience that knocks your confidence, what does that mean to knock your confidence? So it means that you can't manifest the thing, you can't remember how to do the task anymore, apparently. So that's one question. And then the other thing is that how that knock on the confidence and how things that knock your confidence hit you differently at different levels of skill. So I think on the second one about different levels of skill, dynamically, that's a fairly straightforward, like there's straightforward ways to talk about that. So becoming more skilled means that you're becoming a more robust. The new dynamical system that is you with now the ability to do this new skill is more stable, is a more robust solution. You've had more opportunities to explore the space of possibilities. And so the solution you've come up with is a bit more resilient and has more resistance and stability in the face of perturbation. So there's lots of ways of talking dynamically about what's increased levels of skill gets you. And then, of course, if you have if your overall dynamic is quite robust, and in the face of perturbation, then something comes along and knocks your confidence, and it's going to bounce off, basically. And so I think there's a right. I don't know that that's the answer, but there's a natural way to talk dynamically, I think, about skill levels. So that's one way of going about doing it. And then the other one, the question about what does it mean to have that confidence knock on sort of your ability to manifest that skill, to remember it and show that you remember it by demonstrating it. Well, I mean, there's all kinds of things. So I was thinking, so my particular example, my own example, where I used to, I'm quite good at walking on ice, right? I'm quite balanced, and even when I slip, I'm quite good at catching myself. But it must be 10, 12 years ago now, I slipped on a patch of ice and broke my wrist. And then when next winter rolled around, I was unable to walk on ice. Like my driveway froze, and I went to walk on it, and my entire body freaked the hell out. So that's right. And then eventually I got that back. So what was going on there? Well, in that specific case, the knock on my confidence manifested it, if I had to guess, in terms of changes in my dynamics. We walked on the ice, and instead of being a bit loose and relaxed, I was stiff and tense. And of course, if you're on the ice, if you're a stiff walking system on ice versus a more relaxed and got more moving pieces to accommodate balance and give you more options, then you're just going to fall over. You're literally a more rigid system. So again, that would be like, if you're going to go after this, there's going to be no general answer. There's going to be particular answers that live within this flavor of explanation.
Is a general answer possibly that what's happening is the systems being pushed out of that stable state, as it would do if you had too much information in that moment in time, and you go back to freezing degrees of freedom to manage a system. So you're going back to that exactly like you would do if you're going from into a highly coupled, coupling a system to and then that would be general, but the actual specifics of what's pushing that system out of that state could be different.
Yes.
And it could be memory, and it could be in the immediate. It could be immediate, but what it's doing is pushing it so that you lose the entrainment of those, and then your system starts to try and couple to cope with the degrees of freedom, perceptual or motor degrees of freedom.
Yeah, so within this framework, this radical embodied memory framework, that's exactly the way to go about thinking about it. Is the knock on the confidence manifests as a change to something in the organism, environment, brain system, such that you can no longer assemble yourself into the dynamical system capable of solving that task. So you've been reorganized by the experience, by the thing that's not, and exactly right. So the knock on your confidence is equivalent to learning how to ride the backwards geared bike, in that you've had this experience, it's reshaped your dynamics, and it turns out that the new dynamic that you now inhabit is no longer capable of manifesting the previously demonstrated behavior, because for some reason there's some fundamental incompatibility. And the incompatibility in my case with the ice, I think, might be that my experience of falling and shattering my wrist made it so that I stiffened up on the ice, which meant I lost all the flexibility that's required to recover your footing if you slip, right? You need to have a bit of... So, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think the general solution there is and so this is the other thing, right? The knock on the confidence becomes an experience that now shapes and reshapes your overall dynamic and shapes the kind of dynamical system that you are. It becomes a contributor to the kind of dynamical system that you are. And then the kind of dynamical system that you are either can or can't demonstrate the behavior. And just because you were previously able to do it, if an experience comes along and reshapes you, it might reshape you such that you can no longer do the thing. And so again, that gets you away from this notion of, well, where did the memory go? Well, the memory was never there. I'm now a different organism, environment, brain system, and the system I currently am can't do the thing anymore. And I'm going to have to now go through a process and go through an experience that reshapes my dynamic back to where I wanted it to be. Yeah. I feel, yeah. I mean, right. Again, I feel like that vocabulary is pretty natural and that you can actually construct it. But just to flag up, we're very much at the case of just so stories, right? Like it's like the vocabulary is working. And this is good, right? These are test cases for taking the vocabulary for a spin and see if you can get something coherent out of it. And I think that's quite useful. But there's no guarantee that that's, of course, yet what's actually going on. But yeah,
it strikes me, Andrew, that you've taken my mind in lots of different directions, falls prevention, these kinds of things. But
yeah,
it strikes me that what happened when you have the fall on the ice is it's at a moment in time where, to a certain extent, you've reached almost a semi-point of, or you believe you may have reached a point of semi-automaticity, where you think, I'm really good at walking on ice, so I can walk on ice. I've been here before, I'm familiar with it. But if you then don't maintain the brain-body environment connection and attend, you can have a mishap because you've switched that off a little bit. Therefore, and then the problem you then have is when you come back to that space, your relevant familiarity is broken. So therefore, this was the word that came to mind when you were talking about this. Is that you were talking? I started thinking about familiarity, and I started thinking that I think representative task design is bad language because it evokes representation. And actually, using the language you've just described here, I was thinking about we might want to talk about more something like state space familiar task design. It doesn't exactly trip off the tongue, but it might be more accurate. And the reason I'm saying that is that when we want individuals to become skilled, we want them to be able to spend time in a state space, to build familiarity, to actually build I'm going to use this, going to go even further, friendship with that state space. And the stronger that their like friendship or connection with that state space, the more resistant to perturbation they could become, given that that state space is never stable, it's only ever regional, and therefore the dimensions of the region are likely to change over time. So you need familiarity to navigate the region, but you will, but it will only ever be familiarity, but there could be a deeper familiarity by virtue of the fact that of the amount of time you've spent there and the intentionality within which your space and time might be. And so what I was thinking about this, is that it's really helpful from the idea of what I'm used to call representative task design, and I'm now going to call something else, which is that our goal always, because we're working at the brain-body environment scale, is to continuously think about how do we ensure that people can inhabit a state space so that they can gain a familiarity with it.
Yes.
And what we want them to do is to gain a shared familiarity so that they can help in a team game, so they can help each other navigate it.
Yes. Yes. So I like that shift of focus away from the training environment being representative of something in the game environment. What you're actually trying to create is a more persistent version of the game environment. Or no, a more persistent version of one facet of the game environment to give the learner time and opportunity to explore it because it takes time to learn how to remember, right? Organization and self-reorganization under constraints takes time. And if you're reorganizing yourself in some direction as a result of what you're doing, then all of a sudden you're doing something else. You're going to get pulled that way, then you're going to get pulled that way. What you're trying to do as a coach is trying to provide enough time and opportunity so that you're pulled in a sensible direction for enough time to for the dynamic to reorganize itself into something that can manifest remembering later on.
And
Yes.
that made me then
interesting.
think, sorry, I've
That
got
is
very patient
that is
people waiting,
interesting.
but it made me think about like a lot of coaching practice or coaching approaches, particularly very instructional coaching approaches, is like the equivalent of a sat nav. So when you have a sat nav, you don't need to attend
Yeah.
to the landscape. You don't need to attend to anything that's relevant for you to gain familiarity,
And you
so
won't,
that
because you
you
have access to the
can.
sat nav.
Yeah, exactly. So coaching approaches can be like a sat nav, which essentially rob people or stop people from attending to the relevant variables within the state space that are going to be really
Well,
important for them to become familiar.
yes, and another quick way to reframe that, though, is that what you become under those circumstances is a skilled sat nav user, which is not necessarily a bad thing, except in a situation when you no longer have the sat nav. So I'm a skilled sat nav user, and I live in a world where I have reliable access to sat navs, which means that being a skilled sat nav user has enabled me to drive all over the place. But if my phone breaks, I'm dead in the water, right? And so again, almost just a perspective shift on what you're learning is not necessarily bad, but you just have to remember that what people learn is whatever it is you give them to do, and you just have to pay attention to the whole setup in order to figure out what it is they're actually doing. Yeah.
Right, Danny. Sorry, I massively interjected. I do apologise. Go on, Danny. Bingo card, Danny.
I was going to use an example. Yeah, I was looking at my notes on the other screen, relating to something we talked about earlier. But everything that people have said, I've kind of gone, oh, my example's good. So there's two approaches to coaching a forward somersault. Well, there's lots of approaches, but there's two main approaches I've seen in trampoline to coach a front somersault. One of which is supported, so simplified, like drastically simplified. The coach jumps with the person on the trampoline and helps them flipping round, hand on shoulder, hand on waist, and essentially throws them around. The performer may do some work, they may not, depends on who they are, and eventually the coach steps away. What I've seen though is a lot of people then become reliant on that person, that coach, jumping with them, because the trampoline acts completely different when there's two people on to one.
Yeah,
They also
seriously.
are terrified of when the coach steps away. I don't do that. But the immediate thing that I get from other coaches that coach like that is, oh, it's unsafe to teach a flip without you being there. Which, yes, if you say, okay, you're going to jump at your normal height and you're just going to do a flip having done no sort of development of those skills, I agree. But I go with a forward roll, then a low bounce over to your back and build it up. And from what I've noticed is they have the confidence to fail safely and crash, which a term in
Yes.
trampoline is used a lot. So
Yeah.
they know how to fall over safely. And going backwards, I can't do the same thing safely, so I need to support, but I support in the least impactful way as possible. I still have to be on the trampoline for the first bit, but I have a karate belt around their waist, so I'm not fully contact, so I can sort of step away. Karate belt's there. But what's most interesting is when I step away, they rely on the karate belt being there, even though it does absolutely nothing at that point. It's not helping them at all. They just want the belt around their waist.
Yes.
And it's interesting how just the touch of the belt around the waist makes a massive difference to whether they're going to do a backflip or just get scared and then I have to intervene in some way.
Yep. So this is where I always bring up superstitious pigeons. So Skinner used to train pigeons to do various things because that was his whole shtick. And superstitious pigeons are the fact that you can put pigeons in situations where they're learning something, and you, the experimenter, or you, the coach, think you know what you're teaching them, but it turns out that they were also learning some other things at the same time that don't technically have to do with the details of performing the task that you want, but were reliably present at the time, and you get superstitious behavior out of pigeons. It's really easy and it's really cool. Why? Because again, what's the rule? People get better at doing the thing that they're doing. And what were they doing? They're doing a backwards jump while you were there with the belt attached. And so not everything is going to matter, right? Maybe the color of the belt doesn't matter or whatever, but what you found, and part of the problem is, Turvey talks about this in his lectures. He talks about one of the problems of trying to figure out what matters is that sometimes you have very non-obvious causal relationships going on here, or very non-obvious relationships, and they're non-obvious in the sense of there's no clear way to predict it ahead of time. It was just because it was there, right? So what you've identified empirically is something that nobody would have predicted ahead of time. This non-obvious relationship is that people are actually one of the things that's sufficiently part of their learning experience to form part of it's a sufficiently important part of the encoding, the formation of the dynamical system, that they are unable to reform the dynamical system. That's one of the components they have to have in order to do the remembering. Even though, so this is part of the problem as the coach, this is the part of the problem as a teacher of any kind. It's not always transparent or obvious what the learner is going to think matters. And so you do have to pay attention to those things, right? And so then you have to make decisions as a coach, presumably. Do you keep using the belt? Do you just let them wear the belt and eventually get them to take it off? What do you do? How do you cope with it, right? But that's interesting that so basically your learners are telling you something that you didn't know before about what it was that they were learning to do. They weren't learning to jump backwards. They were learning to jump backwards while wearing a belt, it turned out.
What's interesting is from what I've noticed, I've done this with probably around 30 people at this point of varying ages, varying abilities, male, female, up to like 60 back somersaults. And a lot of them, the belt is insignificant and it's me being on the trampoline. But then there's I need the belt there.
That's
and
fascinating.
some people need the mat on the trampoline. There's each person has their own particular focus.
Superstitious pigeons. Yep.
Yeah, and it's so hard to manage what to do with them. I've got someone at the moment that is perfectly capable of doing a backflip by themselves, but they need the mat there and they need the belt around their waist.
Right.
So how do I pull it away? Is the coach.
So but that's the question is, so they've had a learning experience in which they were encoding, in which they were forming themselves into a particular kind of dynamical system. And it turns out that they brought some additional variables along with them. And now you have to decide what to do with those, which means that you're going to have to spend some time with them where they learn how to form a different dynamical system that still produces the flap, because there's more than one way to do a flap. There's at least two ways, with a belt and without a belt, right? And so now you have to teach them how to flip without the belt, which is a different experience for some people, it turns out. And that's complicated and interesting. But of course, that's, again, from an information processing point of view, why in God's name would you include the belt in your schema for your flip, right? And this is, and again, just to hark back to the Turvey stuff that we've been going on with Marion and Rob, this non-obvious sort of causes and non-obvious links is actually quite a central thing. He talks about it I was trying to remember, Marianne, he talks about it in the context of what was his name, like Gottlieb, like the chicks when they hatch and they imprint on
or even if they don't see their toes, then they can't imprint on the bug, so then they can't pick up the mealworms because they didn't see their toes when they first hatch. I mean, just mind-blowingly odd things that create those. And then I think about it as like a radio. They're just not attuned to that information. And they missed a critical period of calibrating.
But the
Sorry,
point
Marianne,
is
could you repeat that? The chickens don't see their toes and what happens?
When they hatch, if they don't see their toes, which look a bit like mealworms, to be fair. So if they don't see their toes, then then they can't see and pick up wriggly mealworms. There's some even more bonkers examples of the monkeys.
Who the hell would have picked that one, right? But the idea is that the behavior picking up the mealworm isn't just built out of seeing the mealworm and having a beak. It turns out that it's built out of a bunch of things, some of which are very non-obvious. And so this is the thing that's really complicated about education of any kind, right? Education is an attempt to purposefully shape the learning process. And it works to the extent that what you're doing aligns with how learning actually works. And
in that
learning
system.
is
Yeah.
full of these bizarre minefields and traps, right? And then you have to figure out how to engage with them.
What was the monkeys? If the monkeys don't eat
Uh,
live bugs. Oh, I can't remember that. And then there are other things that if they don't experience them during gestation, it impacts what they can learn once they've been born.
Just I had my notes on you guys. So I was like so the chicks needs to see toes to learn to eat mealworms. The
That's the
squirrel
one.
monkeys needed to eat live insects to fear snakes.
That's the one.
That's the
Crucial for
weird one,
developing
right?
instinctive behavior. No obvious experience.
Yeah, right. So this was about instincts. That was the weird, and it turned out that these instincts were actually built of a complex web of interrelationships, just like every other skill, right? And so what you're discovering actually is that when you're trying to take some sort of purposeful approach to and to shape that learning process, it turns out it can occasionally be quite easy to introduce effectively some sort of extraneous variable because it's doing something, right?
Amazing.
And it's not.
Grandmaster Howard, you are the world's most patient
Oh, sorry.
coach and grandmaster. So jump in.
Thanks, Andrew. That was great. Just go back to the analogy of the state space in terms of water. Okay.
Yeah.
So in the water, we have pressure and temperature as your variables. So we can obviously then have in the parameters, like you can get water from 0 up to 100 degrees Celsius.
Yes.
And we can increase the pressure above atmospheric and lower below atmospheric. So we can vary within there and still stay in that state space of what we call liquid water.
Yes.
Okay. So if you go over to the state space then of your skill, if you want to call it that, the state space where you're living in, we can vary the body. So you can change your body, you can vary your brain, and then you can vary the environment. So if you vary your body, your brain, you do things when you're tired, you do things when you're hungry, you do things when you're against taller people and slippy floors. You're widening your state space, which will make you more skillful. Is that what's happening there?
Yeah, maybe. So, right. So this connects to the variable versus mass sort of distributed practice and variable practice kind of results that you get. If you vary the training conditions, you get more resilient behavior and better retention of skills, right? Right, let me think. Again, there won't be a general answer here, but the basic intuition that if you encounter a wider variety of parameters, you should end up building a dynamical system that is able to accommodate more of those parameters. And so gives you, more wiggle room, more resilience, and more space to maneuver. It might also be the case, though, it'll be the case that some variability will be good and will train resilience, and some variability will interfere with the process. So the crude example would be if I get you to ride a big bike and a small bike during learning, it'll take you longer to get to learn how to ride a bike, but by the end of it, you'll have a pretty robust bike riding that copes with lots of different sizes of bike. But if I get you to ride a bike and ride a backwards bike at the same time during learning, that's too much of the wrong kind of variability. And you're trying to build an impossible device, one that can accommodate both of these options. So, and I think this aligns with the kinds of things that you see in the traditional model learning literature that gets talked about in terms of schema formation, etc., where certain kinds of variability of experience does provide you with a more resilient, creative, flexible solution. But too much variability or incompatible variability, all that does is those things interfere with one another. But I think it literally gets talked about in terms of retrospective interference and prospective interference as you've started to form some memory schema and start to form another memory schema, and one of them might interfere with the other one because they need the same resources, for example. But right, to get to your point, I think your instinct is yes, providing lots of access to different parameters. But if you start messing with variable, right, okay, that's going to be the other thing. if your variability is defined within a given state space and it's just variability within parameters, then the person's going to spend time assembling. They're going to spend time learning to work with the same set of variables, and they're going to spend time working with them under different conditions. So it'll take a bit longer, but they'll end up with a nice robust exploration of the whole space that is possible for those variables. But if your variability across training means taking some variables and putting them in one way and taking those same variables and organizing them in a different way, or taking different variables, then that's going to be when you're going to get situations that interfere with one another. Does that make sense? I'm just making this up as I go, but I think that's right.
Yeah, so if you go back to the water analogy, that it's like if you had a bad experience like falling on the ice,
Yeah.
you're going into a different state space. You're variable too much, you've gone all the way down, you've changed the temperature too much, you've gone all the way down to solid ice,
Yeah.
or you've gone all the way up to gas. And they're not compatible. You can't be both liquid and gas at the same time.
Yeah, you've done,
Leans in,
yeah. I
leans
think it's,
into what I was saying about it being a control parameter somewhere
yeah,
around that, yeah, that
I
core
think it's,
system.
I think it'll definitely be possible to produce variability that will just interfere. Like you could, like, and I'm sure you can come up with an example of a training situation that's just a mess, right? And like, but then, so then the question is, there's training situations where the variability is okay. There's training situations where the variability is clearly a disaster. And so the real question is, as you go from one extreme to another extreme, where's the boundary? At what point do you flip? What is it that governs the flip from mess into useful?
I
I
suppose
bet
that's
there's
where,
more than one.
Yes.
and
And you
there's
But
so
might,
many parameters. Like we just have body, brain, environment, but that's just nearly a simplification of it in terms of calling it a brain or calling it a body or
well,
in
brains have 80 billion moving parts, and bodies
yeah,
have
yeah,
hundreds and thousands of moving parts. And so to put it all on one axis is, of
yeah.
course, a gross oversimplification. Absolutely.
the tricky thing with this, if I think about it from a practical perspective of people who are trying to work with, I don't know, horse riders who've lost confidence, or climbers who've lost confidence, or paddlers who've lost confidence, is what to scale to get them back into finding it. And quite often they scale back too much, and then as soon as they go back into the same environment that they had the instant in, it all
Yeah.
just goes again. And so I think that's the interesting question, isn't it? It's like, what parameters could be used to get back. I mean, if I think about horse riding and women of a certain age, usually mine, it's almost, everyone, I've lost confidence. I used to be really bold. I used to be really good when I was younger. Now I don't have any confidence.
Yeah, but saying I've lost confidence is labeling an experience where that experience is not necessarily built of confidence. It might be built of a bunch of other things that we call confidence. Calling it confidence doesn't tell you what it's made of, right? So it's a label, and it's useful because it maybe identifies a class of experiences. But like I was saying, when I was walking on the ice, my lack of confidence wasn't a mental state. It manifested in embodied way in stiffening up of my limbs, right? And so for me, the lack of confidence was built out of stiff limbs, right? It
And
wasn't
so,
built out of
Go
a
back.
mental
So
thing.
sorry, can I just get this? So one of the things that I struggle with is when
there
people
you go.
say, "Oh, my coach tells me to pretend I'm confident," and I usually say, "No, don't do that.
Yeah,
Just really
seriously.
don't do that. That's the worst thing you could do, because if you're feeling like that, it's telling you that you are not you
Yeah,
cannot actually deal with this. So listen." It's like that. When do you get off your horse? The minute it crosses your mind, then get off and
yeah,
do something about it, and get back on when you feel that you are now perceptually attuned to the
yeah,
information that will allow you to be skillful in that environment. It's a completely different way to thinking about it of, oh, I'm going to pretend I'm confident.
yeah,
I'm going to do some psych training and pretend I'm okay. And like, well, if you're not, you not being confident is your central nervous system or whatever basically alerting you to the fact that you are
yeah.
not
Something's
skillful
off.
in
Something's off.
that moment in
Yeah,
time. Yeah.
that's again that command and control structure, isn't it?
Sorry, you're breaking up a bit there,
and
Simon.
where we like to think, oh no, my frontal lobes are being like your limbic system sort of. Pardon?
You're just breaking up a little bit and jumping around. Is it just me?
I'm having the same experience as Simon.
Yeah, it just frozen a little bit.
Say again, Andrew?
You're just frozen, Simon. Sorry.
Have I
Yeah.
caught up yet?
There you go. You're caught up now. Come on. That's
I
better.
killed my video. Hopefully that'll fix the bandwidth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought
Aussie internet.
Marianne. Yeah, damn it. Like the confidence thing Marianne's talking about, like saying, go away and do this. It says like again that command and control structure where we demand our frontal lobes to just bully every other system into compliance, rather than, like as you sort of said, Marianne, like okay, no, listen, like our limbic system, I think, is poorly understood. We sort of get these. I got this feeling. I don't like it, and sometimes, you know, that sort of almost needs to be listened to. I think there's an FBI guy that wrote a book a bunch of years ago talking about it was largely around safety and things like that, and said not enough people listen to their limbic system when it's sort of screaming out to them saying, no, you shouldn't walk down that street at this particular time, because if it feels uncomfortable, act on that sort of thing. And I'm wondering also, Andrew, you're talking about, because I was talking about the egalitarian nature, and like if everything's functioning well, obviously we would assume that that's all in balance.
Yeah.
Like your body experienced a trauma and, you know, you hurt your wrist and whatnot. So next time you go on the ice, it's not a bug, it's actually a feature, right?
Yes,
Your body's
absolutely.
experienced this traumatic event. And so
Yeah.
it's like, you know, danger, Andrew, danger. You shouldn't be doing. Last time we did this, it wasn't a great result.
Yeah.
And you're trying to say, no, we've done this many times before. But because
Yeah.
there was a recent experience that for your entire system, not
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
your frontal lobe, for want of better description, experienced all of this trauma. So,
Yeah.
you know, as I said, like the power balance is sort of far more in the favor of your limbic system and your bones and your tendons and things, saying like, last time this didn't work out so well, big fella. Maybe we
Yeah.
should just avoid it.
Well, that's it. And it's like my body was clearly trying to help me not do that terrible thing again, right? Like, but it was such a weird experience, like to know that I can walk on ice pretty well. Like I've had experiences, you know, when I lived in Bloomington, we had, you know, pretty cold winters, snow and ice all over the place. And you know, I had one of those ridiculous cartoon moments where I slipped on some ice once and put my feet back underneath me and then slipped again and then put my feet for about 20, it wasn't 20 minutes, but it felt like 20 minutes, right? So literally one of those. And like at no point did I ever actually feel like I was going to fall over. But like, and then I got it together eventually. And so like I knew that my feet were pretty good at this, right? Except that you're absolutely right. Like something had happened that had not just disrupted my feet, but had disrupted the entire brain body environment relationship. The entire thing had fallen apart, and my body was trying to take the hint. Yeah. But that's
So it's almost like like, and if one of those, I'm thinking like from the confidence perspective, I think as you put out, someone saying I'm not confident that needs to be unpacked, right? Because it's like,
yes.
well, what is it? One of these systems feels like it is not ready for whatever it is. And it could be
Yes.
physical. Maybe it's like, you know, like when you're recovering from injury. My leg doesn't feel strong, you know, I'm recovering from my knee,
Yeah.
whatever. I don't feel strong enough in that particular uh, in the system to go into, and the reason is because there's a lack of capacity in one particular area, or from a trauma perspective, you know, one particular system is still overloaded, and as a consequence has very limited bandwidth to cope with any more, you know, stress on it or something. I mean, I don't know.
Or if it is stress, then you literally cannot form the dynamical system that can successfully solve the problem, right? So this is the other thing that's lurking here that we have to be careful to dodge when you say that, when I say, well, I know how to walk on ice, but I had a knock on my confidence, it sounds like there's a skill walking on ice that is intact, and it's just currently being concealed by by the knock on my confidence. So the idea is that there's this underlying competence, but there's a performance problem. But that performance competence distinction is not one that we're allowed ecologically, and it doesn't make sense ecologically. So it's not the case that there is an intact walking on ice situation that's simply being concealed. The case is that there is no longer a successful walking on ice situation that I can organize myself into given my current capacities. And I had to relearn how to walk on the ice, right? Yeah. So that disruption was to that entire thing. And I think about this, I remember thinking about this in the context with my kids as well when they were little. If you ever watch a little kid, sometimes they'll, when they have a tantrum, or if their whole day something goes wrong, like, you say something, or you try to get them to put their shoes on, and they did it yesterday and they're not currently doing it because they're busy freaking out. But one of the things I realized was I had to cut them some slack because they don't currently know how to put their shoes on in a very real sense. Just because they did it yesterday doesn't mean they know. Their behavior right now is telling me that right now they don't know how to put their shoes on. And so you have to then spend the time of bringing them back into the space and getting them to the point where they can remanifest it, right?
That's a
If the
bad
context is
example.
different, the
Bad
skill's different.
example. Kids are trained to drive their parents crazy by not putting their shoes on at speed. It's like baked in it's hardwired. It's instinct. And it's nothing like mealworms. Trust
There's a
me.
small homunculus. This is the one thing that we're allowed, right?
Yeah. Um, we're probably going to have to wrap, but this is a great conversation and so much to think about. Danny's just taken us into the world of golf, talking about the yips, and I did think about that. The yips are probably you've basically done the equivalent of falling on ice, and
Yeah.
it made me think, Andrew, that and it goes back to Marianne's point about this idea that the way it's so ridiculous when you think about it, that people think that they can kind of talk you into being able to walk back on ice again. Like,
Yeah.
I'm just going to talk you into it and give you the confidence to do it because that's all you need. No,
Yeah.
you're missing the bit of the walking on the ice. And it did also
Yeah.
make me think about what will now be an immortal interview or debate between our very own Carl Jones and Mike Israetel, where Mike Israetel insisted that you could learn to walk on ice on dry land. And I love the idea, Andrew, that you've fallen, you've broken your wrists, your body is now going into like overprotection mode
Yeah.
to stop you from doing it, and therefore it's almost like it's overriding. And over a period of time, when you begin to reassemble within that state
Yeah.
space, you'd start to gain your ice walking skills back again. Mike Israetel would have you just walking up and down the local park and then just slip on there straight away.
Yeah.
You'd be broken wrists galore. But this is very, very people tend to think, which is I actually genuinely think it's really quite dangerous. It made me think about lots and lots of
Yeah.
so-called safety protocols. And I glibly said to Danny, I wouldn't teach sleeping like that. Like it's like the whole safety protocol of how to teach scrummaging in rugby. I'm going
Right.
to teach you to scrummage in rugby without ever really scrummaging in rugby. Well, or teach you to tackle in rugby because that's going to be safer. Well, it is apart from when the geezer changes direction and you still have to try and stop them running over the line.
Yeah.
It's not doing anything to actually aid safety at all. What we want to try and do, if we are genuinely thinking about safety, is we need to provide people with experiences where they can gain familiarity with the danger.
Yep.
And in so doing, they begin to understand how they can navigate the danger. And I think it's a really, really exciting and interesting area.
And there's one final piece there is there's no, like, it won't necessarily work all the time. Like, just because you have the state space that can in fact manifest this behavior, and just because everything's functioning. So, before I fell over and broke my wrist, I had a state space that within which walking on ice successfully was something that I was able to get myself into doing. But you know what? It takes time to assemble a given device, and luckily I was, when I slipped in Bloomington and was doing the whole cartoon thing, I was able to assemble it quickly enough. But one of the reasons why falls are so dangerous, for example, on ice, is that even if you know what to do, you just might not have enough time to get your damn feet underneath you because you fell over faster than your memory could manifest itself, and your remembering takes time, right? So that's the other thing, is like there's room in this account for it not working. And I think that's quite important too. Like there's always that risk of it's direct perception, everything's great, everything's success. Yeah, everything is successful pretty much. But there are absolutely scenarios where it won't work. And it's quite important that we, I think, address those. Because obviously even highly trained athletes get injured because something happened that they weren't able to accommodate. They weren't able to remember the solution quickly enough. Right?
Danny, I'll give you the last word.
I was just going to add on to the safety element, is that when, like, as an example, on the trampoline, the kids, they're learning to land on their front, so a front landing or a front drop, as people probably know it from school. Some of the kids, they don't like grazing their elbows, so their parents put them in a long t-shirt, and then they scrape the t-shirt, and then they put them in a jumper, and it almost prevents the learning, because now they're diving elbows first because it doesn't hurt. And it's almost like the parents doing the opposite of what I want them to do. Like, I want them to graze their elbows to realize, actually, let's not put my elbows first down because it's going to hurt. And as the coach, it's not like I want them to hurt, but I want them to fall. I want them to trip. I want them to make mistakes to learn from. But it's creating it in a safe way.
Because otherwise you learn a bad habit, right? And then you have to deconstruct that habit and go back and relearn something else. Yeah, that's a whole other kettle of fish. Yeah.
Andrew, once again, really grateful to you. It's a real gift you've given us all, that talk. You can see how it sparked a lot of thoughts and interest. I've probably got about 6 blog posts now that I'm probably going to put out, or at least 6 walking dog walk diary podcasts where I ruminate on this concept. I'm extremely jealous of Mr. Gompert because it's gone dark now, but before I could see the snow on the ground, and there was a little part of me thinking, oh, that would be nice, wouldn't it? And he's just about to go outside and walk in that and probably go on his backside, so that'd be quite hilarious. But listen, that has been a genuine gift, a gift of knowledge. I'm really grateful, and I know everybody else is really grateful. Can we give him a round of applause, everybody? On Zoom, you can only see it on visual, but that'll be all right for video. That's fantastic. So thank you very much.